this is what, okay. So I just have a few topics to talk about, and I'm going to give you a very brief history of the captive and the wild populations. And the takeaway message from this is that the management of the blue range population has affected the captive population in a bad way. And this could happen again. The second thing I'm going to talk about is briefly why genetics matter. Why should we be concerned about the genetics of the, particularly of reintroduced populations and the blue range population in particular? And then what should be done about the blue range population going forward? So I'm going to say blue range population because it's easier than saying Mexican wolf experimental population, which is its current term or name. So I'm going to just call it the blue range population because it's easy. So next slide. So here, the blue diamonds are the number of wolves counted each year in January from 1999, so from 1998 through 2014. And as you can see, initially the population rose, and then it kind of roughly plateaued. It fluctuated from about 2003 through about 2009. It fluctuated up and down, and then the population began to grow again. So what's notable about this, or what I'm going to talk about at least, is the initial growth. Well, the initial growth was when they were actively releasing wolves, and so the population grew roughly as they hoped it would. They meaning the Fish and Wildlife Service. Can I present myself at some point? Okay, so I will stop for a moment and I'll say my name is Rich Fredrickson. I have been doing research and commenting on management of Mexican wolves since 2002. They haven't disbanded us, so I'm a member of the current Mexican wolf recovery team, and they haven't disbanded us, but they've discontinued that process. They've started a new process, and I have so far been a part of that process to develop a recovery plan in conjunction with the Fish and Wildlife Service and representatives from the Four Corners states. So I'll continue where I was. So beginning in 2005, the Fish and Wildlife Service, there was this spasm of removals. And so over a 3-year period, there were 62 wolf removals. 8 wolves were removed lethally, and the rest of those wolves went into the captive population over a 3-year period. And there were additional removals outside of this, but they weren't quite so many. It wasn't such a large number of wolves as in these 3 years. Now the 62 number, some individual wolves were removed more than once. So they removed them to captivity, and then they re-released them for a little bit, and then they took them out again. But the takeaway point here is, in a 3-year period, a whole bunch of wolves came into the captive population starting in 2005, and very few of them ever left the captive population. All right, next slide. So here is on the right side of the screen is the age class pyramid for the captive population, and each there's a vertical line, and on the right side are the number of females in each age class, and on the left side, the blue bar on the left side is the number of males in each age class. Now at the very bottom, those are 0-year-old wolves, so those are pups of the year. So if you look at the female side, there were roughly 30 pups born in 2005, and on the male side, there was maybe 23 or so wolves born in 2005. And so the next, you can probably see my mouse, perhaps you can. So the next bar up from the bottom bar, those are 1.5-year-olds, and then the next bars up are 2.5, etc. Until you get to the top, when you get to the really very old wolves. Now the red line depicts what roughly the numbers of individuals, the ideal number of individuals in each sex and age class that you would want to have a stable age distribution for the population. And so why do we care about a stable age distribution? Well, the short answer to that is you once you've grown your population to match your pen space, or in this case, the captive carrying capacity, you don't want to grow your population anymore. But you probably want to maintain it at that level. And so if you look at it roughly, you squint your eyes a little bit, you can see that in 2005, the captive population roughly was had a stable age distribution. And the total number of wolves at that time was 307 wolves. Now, next slide. Now in 2006, so in 2005, was the start of the intensive removals. By 2006, breeding had been severely curtailed. So now you see the pups of the year, there were maybe 3 female pups born, and maybe 2 or 3 male pups born. You can try, and you can look at the bar above that, those are now the yearlings, but those are the wolves that were born in the previous year. So in part because, because the population had reached its carrying capacity, its captive carrying capacity, breeding, the number of pairs put together was greatly reduced. Now this is during the time when the F1 wolves, the outbred generation of wolves, had been born and raised, and now those outbred wolves were having litters themselves. And so the litters were large. By and large, almost all the pairings produced a litter, and they had lots of pups. And at the same time, on top of this, none of those pups actually, I think it's true that none of those pups actually went out into the wild. So, but once again, instead of putting new wolves out into the wild population, which would have been very high with high fitness, they instead were bringing in lots of wolves into the captive population. So next slide. So here is the age distribution of the captive population in 2014, and this is just downright ugly. So if you look at the top, you have all these very old wolves, old to very old wolves, I'll even say middle-aged ancient wolves that are, there's way too many, way beyond what you'd want for a stable age distribution. And in the younger age classes, there's too few wolves. So essentially, the age distribution is become senescent. It's inverted almost. It's almost like an inverted pyramid. If we had looked at about 2011, it would have looked like an inverted pyramid instead of a regular pyramid. So at this point in 2014, the total captive population was 248 wolves, and the managed population was 215 wolves. And in 2014, there was recommended in the master plan 22 pairings plus up to 9 release pairs. So that's a lot of pairings. But in the previous year, there was a lot of pairings. In 2013, there was a lot of pairings, but not quite that many. So beginning around 2011 or so, the SSP started increasing the number of pairings put together each year. But very few wolves were born. And part of the reason for that, or a large part of the reason for that, is that there was this period from 2006 on to actually 2005 to 2014, where very few pairs were put together. So what that meant is a lot of the younger wolves that had low inbreeding coefficients and were expected to have high fitness relative to current wolves and past wolves, they were not bred. And so for the males, that might not have been a big deal. But for the females, it's becoming clear that in zoo populations of mammals, at least around the world, that this has become a big problem. A lot of mammalian females of all kinds, pretty much, if they're not bred early while they're still young, they will have trouble conceiving and bringing forth a litter when they're old or late middle age. So now we have a whole lot of females that were never bred or they were never bred or they were only bred recently after they had already got to middle age or beyond. And so even though they're putting together a lot of pairs, they're not getting a lot of pups out of it. So you may ask, why am I showing the results from 2014? Well, I put the slide together and I first presented this last year, and this is what was available. So, but if you want to go back and look at your master plans for 2015, what you'll see is the pup generation, the new pups produced. Well, there's more. The bars are longer on the bottom in 2015. In other words, it looks like the captive population is putting in a new base. So it's still not anywhere close to meeting a stable age distribution, not even remotely close. But it looks like there is increased success in terms of producing pups, but the increased success is only happening because they're putting together a whole bunch more pairs. Let me look at my notes for a moment. So at this point, from 2014, 2015, it may take up to 2 generations before the captive population again approximates a stable age distribution, which is a really long time, roughly 11 years. Next slide. So, based on information in the master plans from 2005 and 2014, you can estimate that the genetically effective population size of the captive population in 2005 was 41, which is small. But by 2014, according to the information once again in the master plan, the effective population size has dropped to 27. And you may think, well, that's maybe not such a big deal, but what that translates into, an effective size of 27 versus one of 41 results in a 52% greater rate of heterozygosity loss. So it's important. So the captive population in 2005, even though it was a little over 300 wolves, from a genetic standpoint, it was small. And by 2014, it was notably smaller. So that's a problem. Next slide. So this table lists mean kinship and mean inbreeding coefficient for the captive population on the left and the wild population on the right. So I'll just walk through this table for a moment. So on the captive population on the left, the first column there is year. And in 2005, MK stands for mean kinship. So mean kinship of the population was a little bit less than 0.18. And so mean kinship is a measure of the degree of relatedness of all the individuals within a population. So the mean kinship was a little under 0.18. The mean inbreeding coefficient was about 0.15. And if you skip ahead down to 2014, in the captive population, mean kinship has dropped, and fairly notably, given the circumstances, given the hand that has been dealt, the mean kinship has dropped pretty substantially from about 0.18 to about 0.17. And so that is basically reflecting the death over that 7-year period, 7 years? 6-year period, 7 years, 9 years, sorry, bad at math today. But it is reflecting basically the older wolves that were highly related to other wolves that have died off. So the mean kinship has largely dropped because of the deaths of old, highly inbred wolves that were highly related to the population in general. And if you look at the inbreeding column for the same population, the mean inbreeding coefficient of the captive population dropped from about 0.15 to about 0.112, 0.13, we'll call it. And then once again, that's because a lot of by 2014, virtually all of the wolves from the founding lineages were dead. There might have been 1 or 2 pure McBride wolves still alive, but mostly they were pretty much all dead. So over that 9-year period, from a genetic standpoint, the captive population improved. Now, if we look at the wild population, mean kinship in 2005 started out at 0.23, 23%, and it increased to over 25%. And the mean inbreeding coefficient increased from 0.15 up to 0.19. So the reason for that is, once again, it largely results from the spasm of removals from 2005 to 2007. So during that time period, the Fish and Wildlife Service removed individual wolves that were problematic, but they also removed whole packs. And sometimes when they didn't remove whole packs, they would take an alpha and some of the kids, and the result of that was there was a lot of turmoil in the population. And so in the process, the Fish and Wildlife Service ended up removing all of the most competitive packs except for one pack. And that one pack is blue stem. And blue stem was the female of the blue stem pack at that time was female 521, and she is the super wolf who has been the most successful individual in the history of the blue range population so far. So what happened is that she had lots of kids. She regularly every year had plenty of kids, and a number of them survived to the end of the year, and then they started becoming breeders. And so the population has become dominated by the offspring of 521. So in a short time, 9 years, the mean kinship of the population, the degree of relatedness of the population has increased, and the degree of inbreeding has increased, because once again the offspring of this one individual wolf has come to dominate the population. So one way to interpret mean kinship in 2014 in the blue range population is that at 25%, which is what it's at, means that on average, individuals in the population are as related to one another as full siblings. So I have 2 brothers and 1 sister, and my parents are unrelated. But the degree of relatedness between me and my siblings is 0.25. So that's pretty extreme. So if you are a young wolf and you're out looking and you finally disperse as a 1 or 2 year old from your pack, and you're looking for a territory and you're looking for a mate, it's pretty hard to find someone who's not really strongly related to you. So the effect of that will be accelerated inbreeding accumulation if this is left to go on untreated. The next slide. So the takeaway messages from these last several slides is that the removals from 2005 to 2007 have damaged both the blue range and the captive populations. So the captive population was already at carrying capacity in 2005, so there was some reckoning to be done there. There had to be some austerity. No matter what had happened, the captive population would have reduced the number of pairings. It would have had to cut back for a number of years on that, no matter what. But dumping 50 or so wolves into the captive population that really have no value to the captive population, few if any of those were bred. Of the wild wolves that were brought into captivity were bred. So the effect that had was that it extended the decline of the captive population and made it worse. It deepened it and it extended it. So basically, you had 2008. Let's look at my notes real quickly. The captive population peaked in 2008, following 2007, at about 348 wolves. So to get to where you can actually breed any wolves, very many wolves again, wolves have to either be moved out of the captive population by releases, which weren't happening, or they have to die. And in the captivity, wolves can live a long time. So I have a message here from Eva. So is the 50 plus wolves mostly from wild wolves being returned to captivity? Yes, that's correct. So they were either wild-born wolves or they were wolves that were released to the wild, captive-born individuals that were released to the wild. So next slide. So lots of folks say, well, do genetics really matter? And the answer is yes, they do, especially in small populations. That's the short answer. But for Mexican wolves, it's very important because one, they had so few founders. There's only 7 founders, but by the nature of the founding of the current population, that there really isn't 7 founders worth of genetic material left in the population. In the captive population, the number of founder genome equivalents is 3. And what that means is that if it were possible to go out in the wild and catch 3 wolves from the wild that would be unrelated, those 3 wolves would have the same level of genetic variation that the captive population has. Now, the blue range population only has 2 founder genome equivalents, so it has about only 2/3 of what's in the captive population, and there's not much in the captive population. So maximizing, so we're starting from a pretty tough spot with Mexican wolves, but because we're in such a tough spot, it's all the more important to retain whatever genetic variation is present in the captive population, and to transfer that into reintroduced populations. In this case, the blue range population. Now, if the Fish and Wildlife Service were able to actually do that, establish a genetically diverse blue range population, that could be a great boon to establishing future additional populations, and that they could use those, the blue range, they could pull wild-born and raised wolves from the blue range to found additional populations. I know that's what the service would like to do, and they're probably going to do it no matter what, whether or not the blue range is genetically rehabilitated or not. But if they in the future, when they start establishing a second and or third population, they will pull wolves from the blue range population. But if they haven't addressed the poor level of genetic variation that currently exists in the population, they're just going to create more populations that don't have much genetic variation and would not be expected to be very vigorous. Finally, for Mexican wolves in particular, because there were so few founders and so less than half of the founder genetic variation is still in existence today, it's not hard to imagine that down the road that Mexican wolves, even if there are 2 or 3 sizable wild populations, they're gonna become quite inbred, highly related, hyming kinship, and you might get something like the Florida panther, where you have these populations. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong in terms of human-caused losses or human-caused mortality, but they're not thriving. And in the case of Florida panthers, the Fish and Wildlife Service brought in a group of Texas cougars and let them breed for a number of years and then remove them. At least that was the plan. They didn't quite follow through on that, but that was the plan. So, but there isn't another population of Mexican wolves. So if Mexican wolves came to that point, which is very it's not hard to imagine that they will come to that point at some time, then the only other sources are to bring in northern wolves. to provide new alleles, new genetic variation into the population, and that is called genetic restoration. So, they would bring in individuals from Canis lupus nubilis or occidentalis, one or the other. And go ahead, next slide. So ideally, the Fish and Wildlife Service should develop a plan to genetically rehabilitate the blue range population. And in this plan, ideally, there should be a time-specific schedule of releases from captivity, and there would be basically a short-term plan for maybe the next 3 years, and the plan will also be considering a longer-term time frame, maybe 8 years, something along those lines, and that the schedule of new releases, the service would really commit to sticking with the plan. Now the plan can be revised on a regular basis, and in fact, it should be reassessed annually, in my opinion. Now it's not going to be adequate just to say we'll release 5 wolves this year and 5 wolves next year. You need to have a quantitative goal which would be success. And in my opinion, the metric that would be most useful in that is mean kinship of the population. So they need to set a goal, a mean kinship goal for the blue range population, and then try to reduce the mean kinship of the population down to that goal. So since I gave this talk last year, I've started a project funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service to basically look into what it might take to genetically rehabilitate the blue range population. Next slide. So what this slide said, what should be done? Selective removals can reduce mean kinship. Modeling can provide guidance for how many migrants from the captive population are needed to meet a goal. And so what my project will do, it's a modeling project, and it will include a range of removals in terms of how many per year, or what rate of removals, and a range of annual new releases from the captive population. And so right now, so what that will tell us is it'll give us an idea of if we do this rate of releases and this rate of removals over a period of time, we might be able to reduce mean kinship down to this level. That's hopefully what will come out of this. So once again, the service is funding this. So that's hopeful, and they do seem keenly interested. And honestly, in my interactions with them, the folks in Albuquerque recognize that they have a problem. They recognize they have a number of problems, but that the genetic composition of the blue range population is one of them. So I think that is my last slide. And okay. So in my opinion, the time is short for the blue range population and for Mexican wolves in general. And so in my opinion, once again, the service really needs to develop a plan, and they need to implement it. I wrote this last year, so that would mean this year, meaning 2016. And I think that's possible. I think that's possible by the SSP meeting. I should have the modeling work done, and then it's up to the Fish and Wildlife Service and the SSP to decide what they think they can do, what level of management they think they can accomplish given their resources. In other words, what level of how many releases can they manage? Do they think they would be able to manage each year, and how many removals, if any? And with that, I will take questions. So is anybody uncomfortable or I'd say uncomfortable with the notion of actually removing wolves from the blue range population? All right, so a comment has popped up. Rich, can you explain? I have seen statements that 83% or so of the genetic variability of the founders is preserved. So what that is heterozygosity, expected heterozygosity, under the assumption that each founder has brought two unique alleles into the population for each genetic locus. So for each gene, so to speak, there would be 14 alleles. So under that scenario, based on the pedigree, there should be 83%. The heterozygosity of the captive population should be 83%. But really, that's a useful tool in many ways for analyzing a captive population or a pedigreed population, but it doesn't reflect reality in terms of how much genetic variation is really in the population. Hopefully that is helpful. There's another question here. When you mention the managed population, what are you referring to? So in the captive population, there are some wolves that have been spayed or neutered, or for whatever one reason or another, they will never be bred. And those individuals are not considered part of the managed population. They're still part of the total population, and they take up space, and they are managed. They will live their lives in captivity, but they will never be able to reproduce. So when the numbers are calculated, for example, the degree of relatedness or the degree of inbreeding in the captive population, those individuals are omitted. However, once again, they are real live wolves, and they may be viable in other ways, but they don't contribute to maintaining the captive population or to their ancestry is not accounted for in things like heterozygosity or founder genome equivalence. So there's another question: if selective removals can really make a difference in mean kinship, how many removals would actually make a difference? And the answer at the moment is I don't know, because I haven't actually done the simulations. But conceptually, the idea would be to target individuals in the blue range population that have high mean kinship at the highest level. So you focus on removing the wolves that are the most have the greatest relatedness in the population. So how many of those wolves do you need to remove? I don't know, and in part that will depend on how many minimally related wolves you release from captivity. So it will depend. So in the simulations, there will be iterations that have no removals whatsoever, but there will also be iterations that have moderate amounts of removals and high amounts of removals, and the same for releases. So in some iterations there will be no releases, but then in other iterations, there will be lots of releases and perhaps unrealistically high numbers of releases. There's another question here or comment. I'm sure zoos play a role in the non-breeding individuals as holding spaces. Are zoos involved with breeding individuals as well? And the answer is yes. So there's about someone can correct me if I get this wrong, but there's maybe 53 or 55 institutions as part of the SSP, and about 2/3 of them are in the United States, and the majority of them are zoos. So there are facilities that are not open to the public, and there's other facilities that are open to the public, but only on guided tours at certain times. So they have the wolves there have limited exposures to humans, but most of the population is in zoos, and to some degree they are on exhibit. So Maggie has emailed me. There's 54 institutions. 26 of them are members of the American Zoo and Aquarium Association, and 28 are non-AZA. Here's another question. How could the SSP institutions help with genetic rescue? Well, one, the SSP, all the different institutions are loaning pen space to the SSP to house Mexican wolves. Now, pen space in general, and wolves, excuse me, in zoos everywhere, zoos and other captive breeding facilities is limited. And I got to think, in many zoos, there's a lot of competition. So you could have Mexican wolves there, or you could have something else. And something else might be something that another species that is also threatened or endangered and has part of a captive breeding program, or it might be another species that isn't necessarily threatened or endangered, but would boost attendance. So, in my opinion, the zoos and the organizations that have other captive breeding facilities, you guys are our stakeholder. You know, the Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, they recognize lots of different kinds of stakeholders in Mexican wolf recovery and in just the Mexican wolf program, reintroduction program. You know, there's the states, the state wildlife agencies, there's the cattle growers, the sheep growers, the tribes, the counties. There's a very long list of potential stakeholders, but you guys are also a stakeholder because you have Mexican wolves in your facility, but you know, if you didn't have Mexican wolves, you could put something else there. So you are a stakeholder. How viable? Here's another question. How viable is adding northern wolves to the genetic pool? Is it generally accepted as a backup plan in case the genetic rescue were to fail? Well, so at times it will come down to it's either bring in outside genes or watch the population slowly slip away to extinction. And that was the case with Florida panthers. That's a real poster child. There's a lot of other examples of populations that were trending towards wild populations that were trending toward extinction, and then new individuals from other unrelated populations were brought in to shore them up. And so the new individuals would have been presumably outbred, or at least not deeply inbred. But even if they were inbred, if they were unrelated to the struggling population, their kids would be outbred. So it's what from the science perspective, it's widely accepted that in some cases it's what you need to do. Let's see. So here's another question. Do you have any suggestions in the use of the genetic material that has been preserved both in the U.S. and Mexico? Well, that's a complicated question. It's surprising to me how complicated that question is. So it is stored for future use. One question is, under what circumstances would you use that? And there has been smart people that have thought about this in a general sense, and I think even to a limited extent, they thought about that in relation to the gamete bank for Mexican wolves. Right now, in the foreseeable future, I think the best plan is to focus on the captive population, possibly with the exception of working to develop AI techniques, so that down the road, if it's deemed necessary or desirable, that the techniques are ready to go. But for the time being, there has been some discussion about that, but there isn't, as far as I know, a plan as to when would we start tapping the gamete bank, what we would do with it. So there has been artificial insemination using fresh semen in the Mexican wolf SSP that has produced pups. I am not sure if there has been pups produced from frozen semen or not. I'm a little fuzzy on that, but that would be harder. So when you freeze the semen and then thaw it out, they're not quite as good as they used to be, as they were when they were fresh. You can imagine that freezing and thawing tissue, or in this case, sperm cells, it damages them somewhat. And so for the oocytes, the female gametes, there was a paper that came out earlier this year that I'll back up. In vitro fertilization and maturation has been really a difficult nut to crack in dogs, canids. But earlier this year, there's a paper came out that one group managed to actually produce a litter of pups using artificial in vitro fertilization in dogs. But there's still a big gap between what they were able to do there and what would be needed to be done for Mexican wolves to use those oocytes. And specifically, what they did is they closely monitored females as they came into heat, and then they, what they thought was the right moment, they spayed the females, and they removed the eggs, and then they fertilized them with fresh semen, and then they put them in. I'm missing a piece here, but the critical thing there, the critical missing piece was that they did not. For Mexican wolves, you would need to thaw the eggs, fertilize them with fresh or frozen sperm, but then you also have to there's a maturation. The egg, you have to maturate. You have to mature the egg artificially in the lab. You have to create the zygote, create the embryo, and then you need to implant it into a female wolf. And so you need to bring her hormonally along also. So that has never been done in dogs. It has been done in cats, even in zoo populations of cats. So anyway, that's a tough question, and I don't have a great answer. But at some point, people will sit down and have real discussions about that to figure out when and what should be done with the gamete bank. So here's another question. Hi, Rich. Is Carlos SSP vet for the MGW? I don't know what that is. I was wondering if we are at a point, from the point of view of science, where we could determine if the nasal tumors seen in the Mexican and U.S. population are genetic in origin. We know we have higher incidences in some family groups, but looking into genetics. So I don't know the answer to that. I haven't kept close tabs on the captive population for the last few years, but prior to that, it seemed like the nasal carcinoma was it was only a few individuals. It wasn't. It was only a few individuals here and there, and there may be some family. There may be some family groups that are more likely to have that type of cancer. But from a purely genetic standpoint, when you're in a captive breeding program for conservation, such as the Mexican wolves, where there probably is no hope of finding new wild founders. So in other words, in our case, new wild Mexican wolves that we could bring into captivity. What you need to do is the goal is to maximize the retention of all genetic variation that exists. And in the process, you will be maximizing some variation, some alleles that are deleterious. But the flip side, the alternative is to try and one moment. The flip side of that is to try to get rid of or reduce the frequency of deleterious alleles. And there are ways you can approach that, but the risk and the likely outcome of that is in the process of getting rid of deleterious alleles, you're also going to lose a bunch of beneficial alleles in the process. So, maybe down the road at some point when genomics are further along and are more informative, we could take another stab at that, but that's a long ways down the road. Another question, let's see. But the effective result of releases and removals are also dependent on population trends, correct? So how do you best incorporate different population trend projections? So yeah, so currently, up until this last year, the blue range population was growing. It was growing around 25% a year for 4 years or so in a row. So that's pretty fast. And from my perspective, that is a really mixed blessing, in that the population is growing large quickly. And 100 wolves is not large, but if it were to go on for a few more years, it would reach 200 wolves pretty quickly. So once if your population is bigger, it's going to be harder to reduce the mean kinship and reduce the inbreeding levels within the population. So the ideal strategy for introducing and for reestablishing a population from captivity is to establish a small population of genetically diverse, relatively unrelated individuals, and then grow that population to large size fast. But instead, if you establish a population that is not genetically diverse and they're highly related, and then it starts growing pretty quickly, then that just becomes a problem. That's going to make the task of genetic rehabilitation a lot more difficult. Let's see. Effective releases removal. So how do you best incorporate different population trend projections? Well, in the simulations, I can have the population growing at different rates. So, but in real life, you just have to deal with what you're dealt. Hopefully that answers your question. Another question. To the paper Rich discussed 2015 live births from domestic dog Canis familiaris embryos produced by in vitro fertilization via the journal. Yeah, it's PLOS One. It's in PLOS One, which is an open source journal, and you can find it if you Google. There's a website here, http www.vet.cornell.edu/news/IVF puppies.cfm. But basically, if you look up PLOS One in Google or wherever, or you could you don't even have to do that. Just in Google, type in you could say in vitro fertilization, dogs, PLOS one. PLOS is PLOS. So it stands for Public Library of Science. You will find that article. All right, so another follow-up on the nasal carcinoma. Apparently there's 22 cases in total so far. Yeah, well, it may be, pedigrees are good for tracking that kind of thing, and eventually finding if there is a link, a familial link. Pedigrees are the necessary tool to do that. 22 cases over, let's think about this, over several years. You might be able to find something in there. And Carlos, maybe you can correct me, but what are the ages that?
That's fine. I was just curious. Not ready. I'm doing it here because our internet is not working. Thanks. Hello?
Hello? Go ahead.
Hello?
Hello?
I'm sorry. This is Pamela Maciel with the IST team in Arizona. I don't know what happened, and I tried to call back into the call.
Well, you're on it now.
Okay.
I'm answering questions.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Doctor. We were just trying to hear again because we lost connection.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, so I finished with the slides, and I'm answering questions at this point.
Yeah. Just one quick question. Were you able to answer the last text we were able to introduce that was about the population trend projections?
Yes.
Okay.
So the short answer to that is, if the blue range population is growing rapidly, then it means that the task of rehabilitating it genetically is going to be more difficult. So the larger it gets, the harder it's going to get, and the more releases and the more releases and or removals would be necessary to get it to a given point, say a mean kinship of whatever it is you choose, whatever the goal is. So the ideal way to go about reintroducing a population is to establish a genetically diverse population, a small genetically diverse population early on, and then at that point grow it quickly to large size. And the reason you want to grow it quickly to large size is that every generation that the population is small, it loses heterozygosity and alleles quickly. But as it gets bigger, the rate of loss of alleles and heterozygosity is slowed. So you want to establish a genetically diverse population and then grow it quickly to large size. But instead, if you establish a population that's not very genetically diverse, like the blue range population, and then it starts growing, that's a problem. So back to the nasal carcinoma. Yeah, like I said, I haven't followed the captive population closely the last few years. So 22 cases. If the individuals with carcinoma die at old age, they could still potentially they can still be selected for breeding. But if they die young, then they probably wouldn't be bred. Another question: would the preferred method of release from the captive population be pairing up male and female for release together, or cross-fostering like red wolves? So cross-fostering, when it works, is great. When it works out, it's great because you take a pup, and when it's very young, and you put it in a den, and it's raised as a wild wolf, and those wolves are going to have fewer problems with humans and and probably be more successful and less likely to be removed than the captive-born individuals that are released as adults or yearlings. So the problem with cross-fostering, at least so far, is that most years it doesn't work out because there's a narrow window in which you have to have captive pups at the ready to put into a den. And they have to, the Fish and Wildlife Service or Arizona Game and Fish has to find a den with pups that are about the same age. So if the wild pairs that are being monitored produce their pups a bit early or a bit later than the captive pups that are available, then it doesn't work. You can't really do it. So to the extent it's possible, I think it's great. It's the best thing to do, and I know that the state of Arizona is against releases of captive-born wolves unless they're cross-fostered pups. But my feeling is, based on the experience so far, is that is not a strategy; it's a tactic. It's great when you can do it, but it's probably not going to be enough on its own. Another question: how do we best conserve, maximize viable genetics in free-range wolves that are problem nuisance animals and face being removed from the wild? At this point, to what degree should the means of removal, non-lethal versus lethal, be influenced by the animal's genetic value? So it's not difficult to assess the genetic value of a wild wolf to both the wild population and independently to the captive population. So most of the wolves that are in the blue range population currently are not considered valuable to the captive population, and if they were brought into the captive population, they most likely would never be bred. And there's a number of reasons for that. So probably most of the wolves that are brought into captivity are not going to be helpful to the captive population in terms of genetics. Now, they may be good for other uses, such as display or education, perhaps. Now, and in terms of the impact to the wild population, because the wild population is pedigreed, it's a pretty good pedigree. The adults, most of the individuals out there, they know who they are and they know who their parents are. So they have, for a wild population, quite a good pedigree. And so from that, it's not difficult to determine the genetic value of a given wolf to the wild population. So if the Fish and Wildlife Service does go down the road of removals as a means to reduce the degree of relatedness in the wild population, they can target specific individuals based on the pedigree. So at what degree should the means of removal, non-lethal versus lethal, be influenced by the animal's genetic value? Well, I would say that if it's potentially viable in the captive population, they should try to remove it non-lethally. So let's see what's next here. Carlos responds that on the nasal carcinoma, we have seen it as early as 4 years old, but the average is 7 to 8 years old. So the way the captive population has been managed up till now, females or males might not be bred until their first breeding might not be until 7 or 8 years old. But that is in the process of being changed. So it's a regime shift, and there is a lady that has started running simulations to basically come up with a new way to manage captive populations, such that that genetically viable individuals are bred females, genetically viable females, are bred early in life so that they're more likely to retain fertility later in life. So how that might relate to the nasal carcinoma is if there's individuals that are dying as early as 4 years old and they're genetically viable, then they would be, if we can identify individuals that are at risk of nasal carcinoma, and we could also then identify which individuals are most important to breed. And if we know that some individuals are at risk of nasal carcinoma and an early death, then they could be prioritized for breeding before nasal carcinoma is likely to occur. Hopefully that's a satisfactory answer to that. Well, I'm out of new questions.
Rich, this is Eva. Maggie lost her mic privileges, so I was just going to thank everyone for coming and tell them that there will be a recording, which hopefully will get up on the web somewhere. And thank you so much, Rich.
All right. Well, you're welcome. I hope you found it interesting and helpful.
Very much so. Thank you. And thanks to Trek for running the briefing and recording it